Well, welcome everybody to this really interesting and important event, All Talk, No Action, where we're going to be talking about race and racism in the justice system and why it seems so intractable and difficult to both have conversations about this issue, and aren't we seeing that in the last few days in the wider political arena, but also why it seems very difficult to get movement on the really important research, policy and practice questions and challenges in relation to race and racism. I'm really delighted to be joined by a fabulous panel of speakers. So as far away, I'm not going to say on my far left, but as far away from me as you can get and still be on the panel, we have Jason Waugh. Then next to him we have Khatuna Kitinsadze from the Zahid Mubarek Trust. I should have said Jason is from the University of Nottingham, and then it's next to me Angela Charles from the University of Northampton. And what we're going to be doing is having an informal conversation really between the four of us initially, and then we want to open it out to the audience in the room for comment and questions and discussion. And then around 6:45 we'll be taking some comments from those who are joining us online. In terms of the running order, I'm going to start with a bit of a discussion with Jason, talking about a paper that he published with us earlier this year, which was based on a really excellent presentation that he gave to a conference that Khatuna and her colleagues organised late last year. And Jason May and Khatuna may want to talk a bit about that. Then we'll bring in Khatuna to continue that conversation, and then Angela as well. We'll do that for roughly about 15-20 minutes, and then we will start taking questions from the audience and comments from the audience. So, get those ready as well. So let's get on. So Jason, you published a paper with us earlier this year talking about why it was that race and racism was not really being talked about or being studied in the way that you felt it should be within criminology, but then the effects that has in relation to prisons policy and public policy more generally. And it was a really interesting paper. It was based on a presentation that you gave at the conference that Khatuna and colleagues organised. For me, it was one of the best presentations I went to that day, and so I was really delighted when you agreed to have it published in a written form. So tell us a little bit about your thinking behind that paper and why you think the problem of race and racism in prison remains a bit of a kind of a blind spot for scholarship.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, and I have to say thank you to Khatuna here, because it was the question that was posed for us, and it was for the 25th anniversary of the murder of Zahid, the conference was related to, and that's where the paper was given. But we were asked to, on our particular panel, was to ask the question about, answer the question, where has racism and the concept of race gone from prison scholarship? So what I wanted to do in that paper that was given at the panel, and then again for the paper here, was, we know, and we have decades of data on this, we know that there are disproportionate outcomes for racialised and minoritized groups at every single stage of the criminal justice system. From where and who is policed, to who is stopped and searched, to who is subject to use of force, who is strip searched, the recent report on Child Q, for instance, to who is charged, to what they are charged with, to who is remanded and who is not remanded, to who is convicted, through into what sentences people are given, and then treatment in prison. We know at all stages of the criminal justice system, and even into release and onto probation, there are disproportionate outcomes for people who are racialised. But yet, as a unit of analysis, that seems to be largely missing from criminological and sociological and juridical kind of analyses of topics in prisons and in the criminal justice system. So what I wanted to look at in this paper was, well, what might be the reasons for that? And I posited as a provocation, I say this explicitly in the introduction, I presented this as a provocation. I wanted this to start as a conversation, but I proposed 5 areas, and 5 interlinking areas that actually represents what I think might be a reason for that absence of a unit of analysis when we know that this is such a significant issue. The first was just sheer ignorance, epistemic ignorance. You know, we are a society that is remarkably bad at teaching individuals and teaching people about issues of racism and racialisation. And the manner in which in the UK that is related to our past, and specifically our colonial past, and our scientific past. The second major issue was one of fear. And let's not beat around the bush. We now have, you know, as someone who was born in the 1970s and saw the kind of, you know, the marches of the National Front and the rise of the British Nationalist Party, you know, we are now in a circumstance where we are once again, you know, we have a British Nationalist Party sitting in our Parliament. You know, yes, they have better tailoring, yes, they have, you know, more crypto-funded backing, but we essentially have a nationalist party sitting in our British politics. There is a landscape of fear and of hatred that has bubbled to the surface in our society that can actually have a silencing effect on people. You know, and we see this in scholarship, and we see this in around events that are trying to talk about racism and racialization and processes of racialization in our society, you know, become targeted. And social media, and often not social media accounts that are based in the UK, but overseas accounts, you know, perpetuate that kind of landscape of fear. So that can have a silencing impact on individuals. So all of a sudden we've got ignorance on one hand, you know, and there's no real excuse for ignorance, but it exists. We've got ignorance on one hand, we've got this landscape of fear on the other. And then in terms of, you know, academic research, this has become a marginalised issue. You know, often it is racialised, and if we're being honest, often black scholars who are doing research on these issues. So it becomes seen as a marginal topic of research and a marginal kind of unit of analysis within the academe. And there are certain kind of pressures within the academia that perpetuate that, the research excellence framework being a particular one. You know, and I hesitate to reference the ref, given how traumatizing it is for academics. But what we often see is that in order to score well within the ref, you have to be doing research that is impactful, and impactful is often tied to policy imperatives. And let's be honest, in the last 15 to 20 years, dealing with racism and dealing with processes of racialization as they exist in our country, despite the rhetoric and despite kind of every now and then a landmark kind of report, the Lammy report being a prime example, it has not a significant policy imperative. You know, we could have been dealing with this in a way that we just haven't. So I think there was, you know, that marginality in terms of policy imperative also then impacts on this becoming a marginal topic that gets pushed to the peripheries of academic concern. So not only is it not a unit of analysis, the very idea that it should be a centralized unit of analysis gets pushed to the periphery as well. I think there are conceptual issues. You know, a lot of the literature that is written around these topics emerges out of the US, where they have a very particular kind of ontological position around race that is largely perceived as illegitimate in both the UK and Europe. So what we have is, so the basic problem here is, it's very difficult to discuss issues of race without legitimizing what is in effect a very illegitimate concept. Race is a concept that, as we understand it in kind of contemporary terms, only emerged in the kind of 18th and 19th century, and was specifically used to legitimate, or to kind of scientifically legitimate, kind of colonial practices of slavery, and create this idea that there is a genetic or biological variance in the human species, so that what you get is subsets of human species. But we know genetically that that's nonsense, and this is not a new concept. Montague, writing in the 1940s, argued that, the concept of race was one of humanity's most dangerous concepts, because it was erroneous. It didn't actually have a kind of biological reality. But if you're going to when you start using the concept of race, what it starts to do is legitimate the very ideas that underpin it. So it becomes quite problematic, which is why in the report I try to shift, and this is not an easy thing, but I try and shift that discussion to one of racialization, which is the imposition of those racist ideas on populations, or racism, which is actually the product of those race ideas. So there are conceptual issues. And I think the last topic that I present is actually the concept of whiteness. If you have a concept of race, which is problematic, which we've already discussed, which establishes that the white norm is the superior norm, which is essentially what it tries to do, then essentially what you're doing is you're casting the racialized as something else, as an other. But by othering, what you're doing is trying to establish a set of ideas that are the ideal. That's how you other. So one of the things that we don't often understand and don't often discuss is how that idea of whiteness has become centralized to our understanding of kind of processes of ethnicity, of racialization, etc., etc. But the criminal justice system is a normalizing institution, right? We know this in terms of class, we know this in terms of gender, we know this in terms of heteronormativity. Sorry, I can't do words all the time. But it also does it in terms of race and racialization. In the paper that I wrote previously, that we've spoken about previously, and where I talk about the constructs of risk are heavily racialized. And so are the concepts of rehabilitation. What the criminal justice is attempting to do is normalize the individual, but often that is normalizing to a white ideal. You know what I mean? So what I tried to do is take all of these 5 areas and show that they are interlinked, in order to try and posit an explanation for why issues of racialization, issues of racism have become marginalised within criminal justice conversation. There are a few people who write about this, but it is few. There are odd publications that pop up, but they are the odd publications. The Prison Service Journal this year, there is a special issue in the Prison Service Journal which is specifically on racial processes of racialization in the criminal justice system. But how long has that been going? And this is one of the first instances that that's happened. So as an academic, if you're doing research on, let's say, substance recovery in prison, for instance, we know that given the disproportionate outcomes that exist all the way through the criminal justice system, that if you have someone who is racialized as black, someone who is racialized as Asian, and someone who is racialized, because it is a racialization, white, who's going through the same substance recovery program, their experiences may not be the same. They may be subject to the same processes, subject to the same intervention, but their experiences may not be the same. And unless you are exploring that and understanding that, A, you're not really understanding what that intervention, what that substance recovery process is. Secondly, you are not doing your participants honour, because you are not capturing what their individual experiences are either. So for me, you know, even if it doesn't matter what topic we're looking at in the criminal justice system, and specifically in prisons, you know, if we're not having this as a unit of analysis, we are missing things. And if we are missing things, that is not something that is then feeding into the policy landscape.
Thank you very much, Jason. I mean, it's a really, you know, wonderful paper, and we'll certainly in the follow-up email from this event we will share a link to it. And if you haven't had a chance to read it, I'd really strongly encourage you to. And you can see Jason is very articulate in explaining these things. I mean, the origins of that paper was at the conference, Katuna, that the Zahid Mubarek Trust organised, and I suppose, you know, hearing what Jason has said there and thinking about the paper and the challenges that the Zahid Mubarek Trust has precisely in, you know, dealing with the marginalisation of race as an issue within prisons policy, maybe the ignorance and the fear that goes around that, and prisons as a kind of a sort of a normatively white institution, I mean, operated as if, despite the fact that actually many of the prisoners are not white. Where does that kind of leave you feeling in relation to the challenge faced in really trying to get, you know, change within the prison system?
Wow, where do I start?
Short question.
Yes, I think I probably will reference some of Jason's points in relation to policy, because when we describe what we do, we first and foremost we say we are a policy charity, and people ask, what does it mean? Why? So because it's somehow, especially given like 26 years of experience of being very policy focused, I find that currently this question comes as almost, we feel sorry for you. And I do understand where this comes from, because obviously, as Jason referenced this, where the policies omit race and it's no longer priority, it's hard to justify why would you be interested about the policy. But in my view, and in my, that's my personal as well as organizational view, that's where we need to be focused, because that's the foundation. Everybody who has been to prison or works in the prison service or whatever capacity knows that policies are very important, because it's a very regimental system. In fact, if I guess first question asked is there a policy about this? How do we deal with it? So it's really important that these policies, especially at the national level, are reflective of what needs are at the grassroots level. You said about some of the institutions having people from ethnic minority groups more than non-ethnic minorities, which is true. Generally, we know that in terms of population-wise, about 30% of prison population comes from ethnic minority groups, which includes the white minorities, such as Gypsy, Roma, traveller groups as well. And I will find it really, really hard to otherwise anyone tell me that policy is not important, because policy sets tone, policy sets priorities. And it's interesting because when you have to justify the impact, in the same way funders do ask us, how do you justify impact of your existence and irrelevance? In fact, there is a policy, national policy around discrimination complaint system in prisons, and it took us 7 years or 8 years to advocate, to retain the policy, to make it better. And
just to retain the policy,
yes,
it wasn't even introduce it.
Yeah, so it was introduced. There were certain changes which would have been introduced at the end of its expiry date, and it took us 7 years to conduct the monitoring of the processes, then do the evaluation, and then we were very lucky to have the opportunity, such as the Lamy review, where we presented our argument that it's really important that people do have designed designated specific complaint space, such as discrimination complaints, and it should not be amalgamated with more generic complaint system, which usually deals with, for example, missing trainers. So that on its own took us 7-8 years, and it is hard to justify to funders why they should fund you because you've got this long journey of policy changes. It's hard to justify to some of our supporters why it takes longer. But I would say once you make that argument that policy sets the standards and policy shapes the priorities in a grassroots level, especially we've got 131 prisons, I think, at the moment in England and Wales. And the national policy should be really the guiding tool and the baseline how people in these 131 places behave. Not that it should be the necessity in an ideal world, but given those who work within the system, we know that it's really important. There are the tone and priorities set at a national level. Speaking of which, it's really interesting because we did, so currently where we are in terms of policies, we do have national equality policy framework, which was published, I believe, about 2-3 years ago. And I think it only mentions race once when it lists protected characteristic groups. Rest of them is very generic. That's what frameworks do. Needless to say, we opposed some of the language and terminology in the framework because that were very generic. Usually we do advocate to have more freedom for individual governors or prison group directors to decide what they want to do. But again, knowing that sometimes having no direction from headquarters or at a policy level can really lead those institutions in a dark place, unfortunately, because it's all about conflicting priorities, and given the current situation of population demand and in custody, violence and so forth, race becomes a don rather than part of everything. Really should be considered as a part of everything, like normal operational practice. And we did ask HMPPS about a month ago whether there was designated race strategy, given that racial disparities and differential treatment has been reported at numerous levels for the past 3 decades, and whether there was also designated race equality action plan, because whatever these policy frameworks are, they should be translated into doable, tangible actions, because that's what people prescribe, and that when jobs get done. And the response to our freedom of information request was that there is none. And that is concerning, because that again highlights that if you don't have direction of travel, and what does it mean, what's the plan about reducing disparities, that is a very, very dangerous journey to take for a service which comes from 26 years ago, admitting there was an institutional racism which contributed to Zahid's murder. And I cannot say personally that I have not seen any evidence that I could be convinced otherwise, that it's not institutionally racist anymore.
Just picking up on that point and linking it to one of your earlier points about, the 7 or 8 years just to get them to agree to do a little bit more. I mean, for me, one of the most powerful moments in the conference you held last year was relatively early on in the day, when one of your colleagues told the story of a young man who was beaten to death in his cell. And I think I, like most of the people in the room, thought, he's talking about Zahid Mubarek. And he wasn't. He was talking about someone much more recently, and a more powerful way of just making the point, what has actually changed.
Yeah.
And it must feel at times for you and your colleagues that you're kind of just in endless pushing jelly up a hill. And I mean, I don't want to be kind of pessimistic about that. I kind of think that we must be able to do better, but I'd be interested in your reflections on what would actually be required to have the change that we need. Because again, if the prison service is effectively just dragging its feet, and then you're feeling that you're having to explain to funders why your work is worth funding, even though nothing's changing, well, there is obviously a perverse incentive at that point for the prison service to just slow everything down on the basis that organisations like yours and others will find it that much more difficult to get funding because they can't demonstrate impact.
Yeah, it's a really hard case to speak about, Richard, in terms of Sandy Goodman's racist murder, where we mapped about 21 similar circumstances which led to Sandeep's murder, similar to Zahid's, which was very hard for the family. And as you know, family is very much at the forefront of the charity at the moment. And what is disappointing for all of us is that that happened 20 years later, after 7 different ministers promised us that the recommendations were fully implemented. And I would say, you asked me about what it takes. I think it takes, again, the leadership and bravery to do right things for the right reasons. I think prison service came very close to this in 2008 when they published Race Review, following Commission for Race Equality investigation into racism in prisons. Of course, there was a public inquiry going on as well, Mubarek public inquiry. And they did substantial work on making race being embedded in prison. Jason mentions in paper about race not being mainstreamed in academia. I would say same, it's not embedded, it's not mainstreamed, because those 5 years was not enough. Even the report which was published following that targeted work and a lot of resources put in highlights that it was just the tip of the iceberg, and they had ambition to do more. However, that ambition was cut short when the coalition government, we had the coalition government with all the different ideas around obviously the legislation change, Equalities Act 2010, which did have unintended consequences of how race is prioritised at the moment. But that's probably a subject of another seminar. But I think it is about doing things for the right reasons, and to understand that race is not just add-on, it has to be foundation of everything you do. Fairness, the concepts which usually find on the statements when you enter any prison about understanding the importance of fairness and people being treated fairly, but the reality tells you a completely different story, and giving the validity to people's experiences. And I think that's what we don't see at the moment, is that people's experiences are not considered as a valid evidence point. If you don't have a data which shows something which is important from data point of view, then everything becomes just your perception. But nobody pays attention. These are collective experiences over the past 3-4 decades, which can be seen in evidence as in academic studies and different reviews and inquiries.
Yeah. And Angela, I mean, we've been talking about the marginalisation of race, but of course, it's not just about being black or white. We know also that women in prison and women in the justice system are also a marginalised group, and a lot of your formative research has been on those intersections of both blackness and being a woman. So hearing the conversation so far, what's your reflections on how the tendency towards ignoring the question of race intersects with the marginalisation of women's experiences, of women's needs within both prisons in particular, but the justice system more generally?
Yeah, I think it's really difficult. I think when we tend to look at these areas, sometimes we tend to focus on one particular kind of concept without thinking about that intersectional lens and how important it is. And as Jason mentioned before, about actually thinking about that individual's experience and the factors that make up their unique experience. And when I did my research looking at black women's experiences, it was based on the fact that within academic spaces there just wasn't that literature there. I was doing my master's and I'd wanted to actually write my dissertation on that very topic, and there just wasn't enough, so I had to widen the scope to look at women more broadly, and that kind of set in motion that how is that right, that there's not enough literature on this area. And then it kind of made me more passionate about finding out about their experiences, their specific experiences, that intertwine aspects of gender, class, and race and racialization. And I think the fact that there's not much literature in that area is also it's also a wider problem in terms of the criminal justice system, that there isn't much knowledge or information about those specific experiences, nor is there the intensity to want to actually know about these experiences, and why it's so varied and so different for black women. There's that lack of understanding that there will be specific processes or delays, or the way in which black women experience things in prison might be different for them, but I feel like the criminal justice system doesn't always take that into account and realise that there is those differences. Something as simple as trying to move from a closed prison to an open prison, and the hoops that many of the black women I spoke to talked about in order to try and have that happen, which was taking months and months longer than their white female counterparts. That's just one example of how it's different for black women in prison. And if we don't have literature, if we don't have discussions around this, then those sorts of discrepancies are hidden. They're not acknowledged, and they're not. They can't be improved if they are hidden and not acknowledged.
And the risk of asking a kind of a naive question, why was it, or why is it that black women prisoners find it, for example, the example of getting to open conditions, or moving towards a kind of a release planning? Mm-hmm. Why is it that black women prisoners find it so much more difficult to navigate through those hoops than their white female counterparts? I mean, I imagine it can't just be down to just the racist prison officer, or just someone who's trying to make it difficult for them. I imagine there are other factors at play there.
Yeah, I think there definitely are other factors, and I think it's an institutional problem. It's not specific prison officers that are trying to delay the process. I think it's the actual way that these the forms are written. It's the meetings that are held about whether or not this person should be is eligible to move to open conditions. And I think what Jason mentioned about this idea of whiteness and rehabilitation really rings true, because black women are having to go through additional obstacles to highlight, look, I am rehabilitated in the way in which you are viewing it. Please give me a chance like you're giving other individuals a chance. So I think it's a bigger issue of how rehabilitation is viewed within the prison, and the processes in themselves need to be amended and adapted. And I think there also needs to be accountability as well. We shouldn't get to the point where we can see for one person it's taken an extra 6-7 months and there's no questions about, well, why has that happened? What are the specific reasons as to why it's taken that long? And if there isn't a specific reason, then there needs to be individuals, management that's held accountable for that, so that the processes can be more equal and be improved. So I think it's really about having that transparency and that accountability, which I think is really important. and also again what Katuna was mentioning in terms of policy, it has to have an impact. We can't have policies that mention race or mention equality, but again there's no accountability. If these policies are highlighting that you need to ensure there is more of an equal playing field, and we need to rid these institutions of discrimination, how is that being measured? Who's being held accountable when there are failures? So I think it's really important about getting that policy, as you said, making it, putting aspects such as racialisation, at the forefront, but that accountability needs to be there as well.
And right near the beginning of our discussion, Jason highlighted the lack of scholarship in this area, and you mentioned that you were partly driven to do your research precisely because there was so little there.
Yeah.
You completed your doctorate studies a few years ago now. I have to say it's you've also published a book based on it. The book, unfortunately, as with a lot of academic publishing, is for sale at how much?
Yes.
But your doctoral studies is available. Your thesis is available free to download from the Open University repository. So we can put that link in the as they say in the podcast, in the show notes. We'll put that in the follow-up email as well. And I haven't had a chance to read all of it, but I read bits of it, and it's a fascinating and really interesting study. But I digress. Some years on now from completing all of that work, is there any more research apart from your? Is it kind of a growing area of study? Do you kind of still feel that you're somewhat ploughing a lonely furrow there?
I think it's growing slightly. You'll kind of see other people that are doing research in kind of similar areas, or you'll hear someone else is doing kind of doctoral research, and you're kind of like, yes, this is really good. You might occasionally get can you review this manuscript? So I think it's starting to build a little bit, but it still feels like it's kind of far and few in between. Where we need to have a bigger picture. And I think, again, as Jason mentioned, there's so much more we can do in terms of questioning, where is the race within a lot of the academic work? Has it been, has it been thought about? Was it just that it didn't come up, or it wasn't present, but to at least know that it's been considered as a point of analysis, as Jason mentioned, I think is really important that we try and get to that point, because it can get tiring, constantly raising that question of, have you considered this? Why is this absent? And it's about kind of putting that out there and pushing it back a little bit to say, that should be a starting point rather than just a kind of add-on, really.
Thank you. Let's have some questions. Who has some thoughts or reflections on what they've heard so far? Yes.
So, hi, my name is Juan. I'm part of the CMT. I had a question for Jason, if I may. What do you mean by normalising rehabilitation in the justice system? You quoted towards the white ideal.
Let's just take a couple more, and then we'll come back if there are any others. And always.
Hi, everyone. My name is Bawale, and I'm a policy and research officer at Action for Race Equality. I just had a question around when race is identified or disproportionality is identified. It usually follows by action plans. I just wanted to know what your thoughts were on the impact of those action plans, and is that the right way of actually changing things? And if it's not, what could replace it?
Thank you. And I thought I saw a hand going up, but maybe I hallucinated that. All right, let's start with those. Let's start with those two. Jason, there was a question there about the sort of normalising rehabilitation.
Okay. So I'll try and package this into a coherent answer for you. If we take the vast majority of research that has been done on the concept of rehabilitation, right? What you've got is decades of research that is focused on white populations, often white working class populations, that have committed high frequency, low serious offences, who are often in fragmented living contexts in the outside world, often who have substance misuse problems, who then enter into the criminal justice system, go through some sort of rehabilitation, go through cognitive behavioural programs, whatever it happens to be. But what that research has done is taken that kind of offending profile and has turned it into an idealised type. Okay? And from that idealised type, you get concepts of risk, concepts of needs, and then concepts of rehabilitation that emerge out of that. But all of that, each of those levels, are based upon white populations. That then ideal of not only who the offending is that you end up in the criminal justice system, but what rehabilitation looks like, is then imposed on everyone, okay? Regardless of who they are, what they look like, what their backgrounds are, etc., etc. So it's operating at that level, at one level. But what we find on top of that is that some of the kind of, so if you read Paul Gilroy wrote a paper in the 1980s that was called The Myths of Black Criminality. And what he highlighted in that paper was that there are a certain number of kind of colonial constructions of blackness that are now in the UK imposed upon people who come into the criminal justice system who are black or racialised. Okay? So these kind of old colonial stereotypes then get imposed upon people in the here and now. But what happens is that those ideas begin to shape the way that risk is understood. So not only have you got this kind of idealised type of risk in the first instance, but when that is being interpreted in the here and now, it's often shaped by kind of quite racialised and colonial concepts of the other. So what we get is this meshing of these two types of idealised kind of and problematic ideas that are then being imposed on an individual as an attempt, because this is what disciplinary institutions do, right? It doesn't matter whether it's sticking a child on a naughty step or sticking them in a prison. Those kind of disciplinary processes are trying to correct not only the behaviour, but what you're trying to do is get that individual to conform to what you perceive as the norm. Okay? So that's why I mean that you've got these two problematic kind of idealised conceptions going on in an attempt to try and get that person to adhere to what society considers the norm. But in a white majority society, the norm is going to be racialised. Does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
I had some thoughts whilst you were initially speaking about it. I'm lived experience. I've gone through the criminal justice system, and whilst I'm not an academic, I've come to this level of understanding that actually that colonialism to which you speak by design is what the criminal justice system is. It's how it deploys its behaviour, it's how it trains its staff, it's how therefore they act with you, and as you quite rightly said there, how risk is perceived. To those of us that are from racial minority ethnic groups, the risks that we pose on aesthetics whilst inside the prison are very different to those of our white counterparts. If there's a group of black and brown boys together, it's a gang. If there's a group of W1 males together, they're socialising. And that sort of colonial viewpoint expands in every thread that is and does form part of being in the justice system. So, thank you.
Yeah. If I can come back on that, just very quickly. What's interesting is if you look at Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Prisons' report on the experiences of black prisoners and black staff, what they find is the same processes are being experienced by both. Yeah. Do you know what I mean? So it's even black staff are subject to the same processes in prisons.
Thank you.
Angela, I was just wondering, and picking up on that point about, Jason's point about the sort of, the ideal type, which is kind of white, actually. But again, thinking about intersection and picking up on some of the points that you've made previously, I imagine that kind of almost doubly, punishes black female prisoners.
Yeah, and I think it also denies them access to certain things. So, for example, if you've got this kind of standardized understanding of what kind of mental health looks like and what that person is in crisis and in need of mental health support, but it's framed in a way that it's from a white standard. So then when it might be a black woman is in need of that mental health support, but it's seen as aggression, it's seen as they're problematic, so they're almost denied access to those services and denied the ability to show vulnerability. So I think it's very much problematic in terms of rehabilitation, but just access to resources as well.
I know Katrina, you want to say so. Would you like also to pick up the question about action plans?
I will, but I just want to very briefly add, not to dwell too much on the subject because it was perfectly answered, but it's really, really important to take into account the equal access to rehabilitative activities and sort of programs, given that we are now in the process of implementing the Sentencing Act. And we fear that that might entrench further racial disparities which we're currently seeing. Both Jason and Angela spoke about how people are perceived, the behaviour, risk and so otherness of certain ethnic groups, and that's very important to pay very close attention. And at the moment I'm not sure if there is much of the work and attention given to this matter by Ministry of Justice and HMPPS. But in terms of the action plan, I think, over the past 26 years we've been part of, I think, with the good willing of making those action plans work, part of everything what's happening around race, especially within HMPPS and MOJ. And it is frustrating to say that those action plans never went beyond isolated actions. And Angela said about they have to be systemic because failures are systemic. When we talk about institutional racism, it cannot be eradicated just by having a training session which lasts for 12 minutes, for example. So there are lots of things, and for me, I think sometimes I don't want to come across as a conspiracy theorist here, but if there is a trend of why these action plans never work, it could be also the lack of willingness to explain properly people's experiences. And what I want to say is that omission of explanation is very dangerous because it belittles the impact of racism in prisons. And that impact can never be underestimated because we're talking about human beings, their rehabilitation opportunities, coming back to as returning citizens and what they get from the system. So that's unfortunately is the reality, but does not mean that we should not keep pushing. Yes, your brilliant organisation does.
Thank you. There's a question here for the panel from one of our online attendees, Lisa. I'm very concerned about the lack of progress on racial justice in the context of the very recent youth justice reform. Keen to hear why you think this was not addressed. So any thoughts about what we've been talking about here, but in the context of youth justice?
One thing I want to mention, Richard, it is a really important point, and thank you very much whoever asked this question, because again, in the context of the Sentencing Act, we know that does not cover youth justice necessarily, but what we want to avoid is in the same situation we end up in a youth justice system where numbers of children, a great progress was made and reduced, but unfortunately that left a huge gap on the expense of ethnic minority children, which represent nearly 53% of the children in custody. And that is really important to, again, goes back to willingness, action plans, working with the sector, especially the sector which are led by and for the people who represent those groups.
And I think, just to come in on that, I think one of the things, and I think that the point that you made there about the action plans and the isolated nature of that, I think is a key point here. What you've got to understand, certainly when it comes to children who have been taken into the youth custody, what you've got to understand is that their experience and the experiences of many racialised men and women and children who come into the criminal justice system is that the experiences that they have within the criminal justice system are not just isolated to that. You know, if you take black women, for instance, we know that black women's health in general in the NHS is going to be poorer. We know that they have poorer outcomes in maternity units. We know that they have greater instances of infantile mortality, for instance. We know that they have worse experiences in schools. So what you've got is the experience of racialised minorities are accumulative. If all of a sudden what you're doing is treating someone's experience as if it is an isolated thing in an isolated context, what you're not doing is capturing that broad spectrum picture that understands what has happened to that individual. And I think, so even when you do get kind of action plans that are robust and are happening in a way that actually, you know, good outcomes can come from that, the learning that should have happened is not always happening. You know what I mean? Because it does get kept as an isolated incident rather than an accumulated one.
Thank you. There's a question here. I mean, it's quite a big question, and I'm going to leave that one actually until a bit later because it's quite a big question. Let's take yes, Rona.
I'd like to put to all of you, but to Jason in particular, the aspect of looking at the criminal justice system that I come from. Some years ago, I spoke to my colleagues, and we started a website which you can all look at, and the name of the website is it a crime to be poor? ? And so it interests me that in today's discussion, nobody's mentioned the word income or poverty or the fact that minoritized people have a lower income. So this is just something I'd like to bring into the discussion, because we are a racist society. It is a disadvantage to have a black skin in many ways, feeding through education and social attitudes, which leads to lower income. And then there's this intersection between having a low income and being caught up in crime or suspected of crime simply because there are crimes that being poor is in some circumstances a crime. We go back to my research I started 20 years ago. People were very surprised to find that there were numbers of people in prison who had not committed any crime, but they hadn't paid their poll tax. And that was absolutely direct link between poverty and being in prison. And some of them, I suppose, in prison learned the ways of crime.
Let me just...
Maybe Angela, you might like to start us on that question, because you did in your earlier remarks, you did also mention the, the kind of the class dimension. It's not just about gender and race. There is a class dimension there, which I think speaks to Rona's point. So do you sort of have kind of a sense or reflections on those intersections of class, poverty, gender, race?
Yes.
I'm sure you do.
So I mean, even my book, the title says race and gender, but class is also an important aspect of that, and I think it presents itself in different ways, from being able to articulate grievances that are happening against them, to look through policies and prison processes and challenge that, being able to afford hair care, skin products, and not having the and they are more expensive as well in the prison, so not being able to afford those sorts of things. So I think it kind of presents itself in different ways. There's definitely that intersection between gender, class, and race.
Thank you. We're quickly running out of time, and I said there was a question and I wanted to suggests quite a big question here, so we've got about 3 minutes to answer it. Nathan asks, to what extent do persistent racial disparities in the criminal justice and prison system expose the illiberal illusion that our societies have progressed beyond systemic racism? Right,
well,
who wants to? I mean, good question. Good question, Nathan. Thank you for asking it.
I think the idea that we've ever moved beyond systemic or systematic or structural or institutional racism is a conceit. I don't think we have ever moved beyond. We're not in a post-racial society. Let's be honest about that. You know what I mean? And I think any pretense that we have is a conceit. I think it is a conceit that is attractive, and I think it is a conceit that many individuals wish to exploit for a political end that I think is actually quite dangerous, because actually it is often utilised as a mechanism of silencing, and silence, just it doesn't. Well, I was going to mention Matthias and silently silenced, but no one needs to know that geekery right now. But I think any process where you have a rhetorical tool that is being used to silence the trauma and harm that is existing in our society is problematic. So I think it is a conceit that we need to be wary of.
Katrina, I mean, as we've talked about, little seems to have changed in the prison system since the murder of Zahid Mubarek. I mean, certainly, well, in many ways it's got worse, but certainly in relation to, questions of race and racism. So again, picking up on Nathan's point, I don't know who the we are in this context. Are we living under some kind of illusion that actually society has progressed? Because certainly that doesn't seem to be the case.
Richard,
in the prison system.
I wish I could have the illusion that we moved on. Unfortunately, we don't, because that's why I mentioned my contribution about in the context of prisons, institutional racists that murdered Zahid also murdered Sandy Gurman 20 years later, and we're talking about 5 years ago. So I am not under any illusion that we moved on. Because we have not been honest about evaluating those root causes, systemic failures that Angela was speaking about. And until we are courageous enough to address systemic issues, we will never address it, unfortunately. Hopefully it will be in my lifetime, but if not, we are here to continue.
I think we have time probably for about one more question. Yes. Oh, well, okay, we'll take two. Yes, but
I'm not sure it's a question, but it was. I was glad that you raised that because for a decade I worked at the Crossroads Women's Centre in Kentish Town, and there were a number of women's organisations based there. Didn't just support women, supported men as well, but it was mainly the mothers and the sisters and the aunties doing all of the justice work. And there were so many groups based there. So there was the English Collective of Prostitutes, and you saw straight away all of our casework. You could see the racism running through the strand of everybody. So it's really important to connect different groups. We had a single mothers group, and you knew that every case you were fighting, you were fighting to make positive changes for everyone. But the amount of racism that is sex workers, single mothers, immigrant women going through the family courts, the racism there is just running through, it feels like every institution. So I know there's not much research. We did work with some really good academics, one in Canada, one here from the University of Brunel. But I think it's about, when you're talking about the justice system, it's again the women and the men that are being sent to prison for non-violent crimes, for crimes that aren't really crimes. And when you're doing your research, I'm not an academic, so it's probably a silly question, or maybe not a great observation, but is it worth opening up to the peak starting at the very beginning with, well, every single strand of the reasons why people are going to prison are underpinned with such racism. So not just, but the family courts as well, not just the criminal courts, the immigration courts.
So I don't know if it's worth expanding research in the criminal justice system. I don't know. It's just my observation of where we see so much racism in. It's connecting the different groups, I think, makes it stronger, doesn't it?
Thank you.
Yes, thank you all very much for a very interesting panel discussion. My question really is, in the face of all of this unrelenting, depressing news, is there anything that any of you can identify where we have made some positive progress over the last 2.5 decades or longer?
Well, that sounds like a very good.
I mean, with this one, it's a very good kind of a place to end on. So perhaps some final quick reflections from our panel. Who wants to pick up maybe Elaine's point or the slightly more specific point there?
I'll pick up the, sorry, I don't remember your name, but
I didn't tell you, sorry, Nicola.
Nicola. I think it's really important to look at the experiences prior to that, and also looking at, as you said, different areas, different institutions, and that's part of, you know, in my book, I try to highlight that we need to look at their experiences prior to them going into prison, because that shapes how they are able to navigate the prison system, the lack of trust that they'll have. So I think it's really important. We shouldn't just look at it as, you know, the starting point of, you know, the criminal justice system or the prison, but we actually need to look at other experiences, how they've been failed in other places as well.
And Katuna, I mean, has anything got better?
Some things, but unfortunately they are too little and too few to make a difference, so I won't celebrate them, I'm afraid. Otherwise I will be doing disservice to people I represent, I work with. So I'm going to pass on to Jason for more high note on this matter.
No pressure, Jason.
No pressure, yeah. Sweet. Despite the lack of scholarship, I still think that we have developed knowledge and developed information and developed data that actually allows us to have a better understanding of what the experiences of racialized minority groups are in the criminal justice system. And I think that's important. So one of the points that Ben Bolin and Coretta Phillips made in their book on crime and race and justice in the early 2000s was that we need to be able to go beyond the issue of disproportionality, because disproportionality is a kind of superficial understanding of what's happening. But not only is it superficial, it allows people to kind of dismiss what's happening, because there's no emotion, there's no emotivity in those accounts. And I think one of the things that we now have is a greater, you know, for instance, in Angela's book, you know, an understanding of the experiences of black women in prison. There is an undeniability to those accounts. And I think it is in that where we have made real progress. As limited as it has been, and as much resistance as it has engendered, because every time you produce one of these texts, you get resistance. I mean, the conference last year is a prime example of the resistance that these things can engender. And I think that resistance is growing more overt. But actually, those stories will last. What Angela has done here, what others have done, will last. And it is in that lasting impact that I think we are getting better, because it cannot be denied once it's out there. So even though the resistance is growing and the resistance seems to be swamping everything at the moment, that will fade away, but those stories will exist and will remain. And when people understand those stories, that's when we will get change. And that's where I have some hope.
Thank you very much, Jason, and thank you very much, Angela and Katuna too. That brings this, at least the formal part of this this evening, to a close. We have been recording this, and so we will be putting the the finished recording on our website as well. So that will also remain and hopefully will be a source of knowledge and challenge for those who haven't been able to join us today. But thank you those who joined us online this evening. We're very keen to make these events both open to those to attend in person as well as online. So maybe some of those who joined online, perhaps we'll see you in person for our next event. And thank you all of those who took the trouble to come in to actually be here in person today, and hope to see you at a future event also. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.